My oldest son, Marcus, said it without looking up from his plate. We were at his house, Sunday dinner. The kind that gets scheduled 2 weeks in advance now, which is something I had never noticed until I started noticing everything. He said, "Dad, we've already made the decision." And I said, "I know, I just think," and he said quieter, like he was correcting a child, "We've already made the decision, Dad." That was it. No argument, no raised voice, just the flat final sound of a door closing. My name is Eugene. I'm 84 years old, and I want to tell you what happened after that dinner. Not to warn you, not to tell you what to do, just because it's the kind of thing a man doesn't forget. I drove home that night thinking about my father. Samuel Johnson was not a warm man. He was a reliable man, which I understood for most of my life to be the same thing. When I was around 9 years old, he told me to stand up straight in the living room and repeat a sentence back to him. I don't remember what I'd done wrong. I remember his posture. I remember that he didn't raise his voice. The most frightening thing about my father was that he never needed to. I spent 60 years trying to be that. The man in the room who doesn't need to raise his voice, the man who handles things, the man who is never a burden. And sitting in my car outside Marcus's house, I realized I had become something else entirely. Somewhere between being steady and being silent, I had become optional. It didn't happen all at once. That's never how it happens. It starts small. You notice your children stop asking your opinion on things they used to ask about. A job decision, a move, a conversation about the grandchildren. You assume they're busy. You assume they've got it handled. You don't want to seem like you're inserting yourself, so you stay quiet. And the quieter you get, the easier it becomes for them to forget to invite you in. It's not cruelty. Most of the time, it isn't even noticed. It's just the slow drift of a boat that nobody bothered to tie off. By the time Marcus said those words to me, I had been untied for years. I'm going to tell you what I tried first because this is important. When a man like me realizes something is wrong, he doesn't sit with it. He solves it. That's what 60 years of work teaches you. Problems have solutions. Solutions require action. So I acted. The first thing I did was show up more. I thought maybe the issue is proximity. Maybe if they saw me more, the distance would close. I started calling more often. I'd drop by Marcus's house on Saturdays without much reason. I offered to fix things that didn't need fixing. I volunteered for things before anyone asked. I babysat when they needed it and stayed longer than I should have. For about a month, this seemed to help. The calls felt warmer. Marcus's wife, Denise, started texting me about the grandkids. Jordan, their oldest, started asking me questions about things I actually knew about, small repairs, how to do things with your hands. I thought, this is it. This is what I needed to do. Be present. Fill the space. But then it shifted again, slowly. The way cold comes into a room, not all at once, just a degree at a time. I noticed that when I called, Marcus would answer differently depending on the time. Midweek, he'd pick up but keep one foot out the door, giving me half his attention. I could hear his keyboard. I could hear his television. I could hear everything except the sense that he was actually glad I'd called. And I'd keep talking, filling the silence, talking more than I meant to, just to justify having called at all. I'd hang up and feel worse than before. The Saturday visits became shorter, then less frequent. Then Marcus mentioned casually that Saturdays were actually a little busy now. He didn't say don't come. He didn't need to. I had shown up more, and they had made less room. So I tried something else. I decided the problem was that I wasn't useful enough, not in the showing up sense, but in the practical sense. I had things to offer, experience, knowledge, decades of knowing how to navigate the kind of problems that blindside you in your 40s and 50s. I just needed to remind them of that. I started offering advice more directly. When Renee called about a problem she was having with her landlord, I told her exactly what to do. When Anthony mentioned a situation at work, I laid it out for him. When Calvin was going through something with his youngest, I told him what I thought he was doing wrong. I was not unkind about it. I was clear. I was specific. I had lived through versions of every one of those situations. I knew things they didn't know yet. This is going to sound ridiculous, but at one point I had a whole system. I was keeping notes, little reminders to myself about what each child had mentioned so I could follow up, so I could demonstrate that I had been listening, that I was still engaged, still relevant. I had a notepad on my kitchen counter like I was running a small office operation. My neighbor Daniel came by one afternoon to return a wrench I'd lent him, saw the notepad, and asked if I was writing a book. I told him no. He looked at it again and said, "Looks like a case file." He wasn't wrong, but the advice didn't land the way I intended. Renee stopped mentioning problems when we talked. Not in a dramatic way. Just gradually the problems disappeared from our conversations. Anthony started qualifying things before he said them. "I know you'll probably say," and then he'd preempt whatever I was about to offer and wave it away. Calvin told me once, not unkindly, "Dad, I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm just telling you, I had been giving them the most honest thing I had, and it was making them speak less honestly with me. The third thing I tried was the hardest to admit. I decided that maybe the real problem was that I had stopped being easy to be around. That somewhere along the way I had become heavy, too serious, too much of the thing that people call a lot. So I tried to be lighter. I laughed more at dinners than I felt like laughing. I made jokes about being old, the kind of self-deprecating jokes that are meant to make everyone comfortable, to signal that I wasn't fragile, that they didn't have to handle me carefully. I talked less about Lorraine. I talked less about the past in general. I stopped bringing up things that had happened between us, the children and me, things I thought still needed saying. I became a pleasant dinner guest in my own family, and it worked in the most hollow way imaginable. The dinners got lighter. People relaxed. There was more laughter. And I sat in the middle of it feeling like a man watching his own life through a window, present in body. Nowhere near the room in any way that mattered. Teresa noticed. She's perceptive, my fifth child always has been. She called me about 2 weeks into this and said, "You seem different lately." I asked her what she meant. She said, "I don't know. Like, you're not really there." I told her I was fine. I used that word. Fine. The same word I had been using for 60 years to end conversations before they could become real. She let it go. I heard in her silence that she knew I was lying, and she let me have the lie anyway, because she had learned long ago that if you pushed me, I'd just reinforce the wall. I had become so good at being fine that I had disappeared completely. It was Lucas who said the thing that undid me. Not my grandson, the boy downstairs. Daniel's son, 11 years old, quiet in the way that means he's always thinking. He comes by on weekends sometimes, asks small questions, fixes things with me when I let him, doesn't talk much. That Saturday, I was sitting at my kitchen table after a call with Marcus that had gone the usual way, pleasant and hollow, and Lucas knocked on the door to ask if I could help him figure out why his bike chain kept slipping. We went down to the sidewalk. I crouched down, which took longer than it used to, looked at the chain, adjusted the tension. He watched the whole time without speaking. When I stood back up, he said, "My dad says you know how to fix everything." I said, "Your dad's being generous." He said, "He says it like it's true." And then he got on the bike and rode down the sidewalk, and I stood there watching him, and something cracked open in my chest. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way an old house settles. I had spent the better part of a year trying to convince my children that I still had value, showing up more, advising more, performing lightness I didn't feel. And not one of those things had given me back what I had lost, which wasn't their respect, I realized standing on that sidewalk. What I had lost was my own. I stopped calling so often, not as punishment, not as a strategy. I just stopped reaching toward people who weren't reaching back and pretended it was normal. I let a week go by without initiating. Then another. The quietness was uncomfortable at first, the way any honest thing is uncomfortable when you've been avoiding it. Marcus called on a Wednesday. Not Saturday, not Sunday. Wednesday mid-morning. He said he was just checking in. I told him I was in the middle of something, which was true. I was walking. I had started walking in the mornings again the way I used to before my 60s, just to be outside, just to have somewhere to go that had nothing to do with being useful to anyone. He said, "Oh, okay, I'll let you go." I said, "Come by Sunday if you want." He said he would. He did. And something was different. Not the conversation, not the food, nothing you could point at. But he stayed longer than usual. He helped me with something in the kitchen without being asked. He mentioned something he was worried about, real worry, the kind he used to keep away from me. And he said it plainly, without the prefacing, without the "I know what you're going to say." He just said it. I didn't fix it. I just listened. When he finished, I said, "That sounds hard." And he looked at me the way you look at someone who has finally spoken your language after years of a polite mistranslation. I stopped explaining myself. I had spent decades justifying my choices to my children as if I owed them a defense of every decision I made. Why I was doing something. Why I hadn't done something else. As if the fact of needing to explain it was proof that I should be ashamed of it. I stopped. Not rudely. I just stopped offering the apology before anyone had asked for one. Naomi called, the way Naomi calls, like she's walking into a room and rearranging the furniture. She mentioned something I'd said at dinner a few months before, something she'd misunderstood, and she started in on it. I let her finish. Then I said, "I don't think that's what I meant, but I hear you." And then I changed the subject. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "That's it? You're not going to argue?" I said, "No." She laughed, short and surprised. And then she told me something funny that had happened at work, and we talked for 40 minutes. I don't know what Naomi heard in that moment. I know what I felt. I felt like a man who had stopped needing her to understand him in order to believe he was worth understanding. That's a small thing to say. It took 73 years to mean it. Calvin came by alone one afternoon without his wife, without his kids. He sat at my table and asked me something he had never asked me directly before. He asked me if I regretted things. Not in a challenging way, genuinely. Like a man who is starting to wonder about his own account. I sat with it. I told him yes. Not the sweeping kind of regret, not the kind that makes you want to rewrite everything, the specific kind. The kind where you remember a particular moment, a face, and know that you handled it wrong, and the wrongness is still sitting there in the room with you even now. I told him about a night when he was a teenager, and I won't put all of it here because some things belong between two people. But I told him that I had mistaken firmness for love in a moment when he had needed something softer. I didn't dress it up. I didn't qualify it. I just said it. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I wondered if you ever thought about that." I said, "I think about it." He nodded. We sat in the kitchen together for another hour and talked about things we had never managed to say out loud in 40 years of knowing each other. Not everything. You don't undo 40 years in one afternoon. But something shifted in the room, something that had been weight for a very long time. He left and hugged me at the door. A real hug, not the sideways kind. And I stood in the doorway after he'd gone and thought about my father, who I had loved and feared and never fully known. And I thought maybe I'm not running out of time. Maybe I just needed to stop running. I'm grateful for the length of my life in a way I couldn't have predicted at 50. Not because it has been easy, but because it was long enough for things to arrive that were worth waiting for. A Wednesday call, an afternoon in the kitchen, a boy on a bicycle, 40 minutes of honest laughter with a daughter who used to exhaust me because I didn't understand that her directness was love translated into a language I hadn't learned yet. I spent a long time measuring my worth by what my children needed from me. I don't do that anymore. I just try to be worth sitting with. Worth the drive over. Worth the call on a Wednesday. Some mornings I sit with my coffee and I think about all the years I was so focused on being solid that I forgot to be present, and I feel the weight of that. But I also think I'm still here. The story isn't done. That's not nothing. For a man my age, that's everything. If you've been sitting with me through this, thank you. I mean that in the plainest way I know. If it felt like something you needed to hear, come back. There's more I'm still figuring out, and I'd be glad for the company.